name is Michael Erlewine, and I'm the founder of the All Music Guide, which is probably the largest music site on the internet. And what you just heard was me playing harmonica some 46 years ago when I was the lead singer and amplified harmonica player for the Prime Movers Blues Band. That was a harmonica solo from an old Eddie Burns tune called Orange Driver. Now here I want to write about my personal memories of the first Ann Arbor Blues Festivals back in early August of 1969. And if you're looking for details, biographies, and so on for these festivals, this video's not it. But I did write the entire text for an award-winning book about the festivals, and that does include a general history of the festivals with photos by the great blues photographer Stan Livingston. You might want that, and you can find it on Amazon.com. Now, I've yet to write my own personal story of those festivals, of that event. So I'm telling it now in this short video, which is based on some footage that my brother Stephen shot over 43 years ago. Now this footage is old and somewhat faded, but it's thanks to Stephen that we have it at all. He had the foresight to document what turned out to be, for me at least, one of the most important times in my life. So thanks, Stephen. And before I get into it, I have to back up a bit. I want to first tell you something about how it was way back then, and then how it was for me in the 1960s. I'll start by saying that in every life, there are turning points, forks in the road, which if taken, can change our life. That first Ann Arbor Blues Festival in 1969 was just such an event for me. I've never been the same since, nor wanted to be. When I am sometimes asked how I happened to miss an experience like the great Woodstock Festival in August of 1969, it was actually August 15th through the 18th, my answer is simple. I was still in the throes of, and I still am in the throes of, and recovering, from the landmark Ann Arbor Blues Festival that was 2 weeks earlier, August 1 to 3 of 1969. Which in my life, was an even more important cultural event, because it was a gathering together of some of the greatest living blues masters for an event that could never be repeated, if only because of impermanence. Some performers died later that very year, and today almost none of them are still alive. The first blues festival, the one in 1969, and the one that followed it in 1970 were basically one-time events. But as mentioned, I need to preface all of this a bit to give you some context. What's called the 60s, what we call the 60s, did not really start until the middle of that decade, in 1965 to be exact. It was in the summer of 1965 that the band Grateful Dead was first formed in the Bay Area. But the cultural event that we call the 1960s didn't just have a single starting location like San Francisco, but rather like a hot rash, it broke out all over this country and then gradually spread to the world. I should know because I was there, and I came up during that time. In fact, in the same summer of 1965, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, my brother Dan and I formed the Prime Movers Blues Band. We'd never even heard of the Grateful Dead. So what we now call the 60s arose all across the nation more or less simultaneously, especially where LSD had done its work. In my opinion, the common catalyst, the true cause for what we call the 60s, was the advent of LSD, which appeared in this country somewhere around 1964. Because you see, the original Sandoz patents for LSD expired in 1963, so the drug was free at last to travel, and it did. LSD was literally a game changer, a mind changer for a whole generation. It opened up vast mental vistas that are still being explored today over 50 years later. Personally, I dropped acid in May of 1964 in Berkeley, California, where I was spending a year. And I had tried various drugs before that, including, marijuana and peyote, speed, even codeine, that kind of thing. And as I've written many times, it was only LSD that really got my attention. In fact, it was, believe it or not, also my introduction to the Dharma, to the way things actually are in the mind. LSD showed me that the outside world that I saw and that I believed in was the result of my own inner projections, including all my likes, dislikes, biases, and prejudices. LSD cut through the stagnant mental firewall of the 1950s like a blowtorch. The genie was out of the bottle and not about to go back in anytime soon. It was what I saw on LSD that fueled my interest in phenomenology, the study of my own consciousness and mind. And only later it was the Dharma, particularly from the Tibetan Buddhists, that organized all of this for me and provided a path or method for continued development and even more awareness. Now, I've thought about these things for 50 years, and I can find no other cause, no other principal cause for what we call the 60s other than the advent of LSD on the scene. It was the single main catalyst that sparked what has been called the hippie revolution. Of course, not everyone took acid, but most of the leaders of that movement did. It changed the mind of an entire generation, one person at a time. LSD gave us the courage and the will to overturn the status quo in favor of a new reality, one based on direct experience. Now I want to talk about those Arbor Blues Festivals, but also about my own band, the Prime Movers Blues Band. Although we were not students, and we were not connected to the University of Michigan, or even officially part of the Ann Arbor Blues Festival committee, we were easily identified with blues music in the Ann Arbor area because we played it all the time and had been doing so for years. So that's how we became part of the festivals. Our band, called the Prime Movers Blues Band, was perhaps the first of the new 1960s style groups in the Ann Arbor, Detroit area. As mentioned before, we formed in the summer of 1965, the same time that the Grateful Dead did. And although some 37 musicians moved through the band over time, the main players were my brother Dan on lead guitar and myself as lead singer and amplified Chicago-style harmonica. Sometimes I played rhythm guitar. Robert Sheff, today known as Blue Gene Tierney, was our keyboard player. Jack Dawson, and sometimes Eileen Silverman, played bass, and a young James Osterberg, now known as Iggy Pop, played drums, and later our drummer was J.C. Crawford. We never recorded much, and what we did apparently was lost. However, my brother Stephen Erlewine dug a bunch of old, moldy, reel-to-reel tapes of the Prime Movers out of his basement some years ago. And what they amount to is about 2 sets of songs, one early in our career of the band and one later. That's all we have. And for those who want to hear what we sounded like, here's something from way back then.
baby. But I say I'm the country man. I say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Better come see me as soon as you can. Look over yonder, hand me down my walking. Yeah, I know you don't love me, baby, yonder comes the man. Over yonder wall, hand me down my walking cane. Hey, yonder wall, hand me down my walking cane. Yeah, I know you don't love me, baby, yonder comes your man.
We had been listening to, studying, and playing the blues for years. Moreover, we had been to Chicago a number of times, down to the south and west sides of Chicago, where we could hear the great blues artists play in their own clubs. We saw Little Walter, Buddy Guy, Junior Wells, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Magic Sam, and many other blues artists live on their own turf. So we just knew more about the music and the players than most of the students putting on the first blues festivals. It was just a natural fit. And we were probably more excited about the festival than they were. As for myself, I was enthused beyond imagining that almost all of my blues heroes were coming to Ann Arbor and would play here. After all, aside from looking for someone to love, about all I did in those days was to listen, study, and play the blues, carefully tracing out the history of this or that artist, and trying to hear something of everything that they put out, and getting to know and play the tunes. I have been told that by my almost exclusive interest in black music, I missed a lot of other music by my peers, which really just to me makes my point. From where I stood back then, most modern white musicians were doing the same thing I was, listening to the great artists, which in blues and jazz means mostly black artists. Why would I be listening to my peers when I could hear Muddy Waters and Big Walter Horton live or on records? It was the same with Dylan. I had traveled with Bob Dylan back in 1961. Helped him to put on a concert that he did at the Michigan Union in Ann Arbor, so I knew him somewhat. And sure, Dylan was very bright, but to me, he was just another folk music traveling guy like myself. Of course, this was before he was Bob Dylan. Why should I listen to him in particular? Because both he and I were listening to the same stuff, groups like the Swan Silvertones or the Mighty Clouds of Joy and others. Sure, looking back today, I can see why Dylan was special, but you get my idea, I hope. An artist like Janis Joplin interested me not at all. I had met Joplin, hung out with her at the Grande Ballroom drinking whiskey. Well, she drank most of the whiskey, but it was fun to meet her. But as to her music, I'm reminded of a story told to me by the great poster artist Stanley Mouse when I interviewed him some years ago. Mouse said that Joplin rehearsed, and I believe he said, in an old firehouse. And one day the police showed up at the door because they had reports of a woman screaming. Now, to me, that's funny. So if you get the idea that in those years that I was very myopic, focused on this black music, you'd be right. I was focused on blues music and some jazz, and we were playing that music wherever we could, in particular at a black bar down on Ann Street in Ann Arbor, where there was a one-block section of black businesses. It was called Clint's Club. And we were performing there several days a week for $35 a night. And that was for the whole band, all 5 members. Let me see, that adds up to like $7 a night for each of us. But even promises of real money failed to distract me from just my interest in the blues. And I've told this story before, but at one point a subsidiary of Motown came up to Ann Arbor from Detroit in their long black limousines, and they proceeded to court our group, the Prime Movers Blues Band. It seems they wanted to find a group of white guys, white musicians that could play black music. We were sometimes racially mixed, but mostly the band was white. And for a while they drove us around in those limousines, and they painted wonderful scenarios for us. For example, just to give you one, they arranged for my brother Dan and I to have lunch with Don and Phil Everly, the Everly brothers. Wow. What a thrill that was, sitting at a table for 4 with our heroes, and I'll never forget it. However, that romance didn't last long. When it came right down to it, to where the rubber meets the road, they wanted us to play songs that they gave us, with no freedom on our part to choose anything. And I'm sure they probably knew a lot more than we did about what would be good for us to make hits. However, I just was not a bit interested in being their musical puppet. And so we totally refused to do what they wanted, and that was the end of the limousines, and no more Everly Brothers. So looking back, we probably refused what could have been a big break. But at the time, and even now, I never blinked. All I did was study, practice, and attempt to play the blues music that I so respected. And then came the festivals. While the Prime Movers Blues Band, my group, may have missed our chance to make it big with the Motown people, we were really right on time for that first Ann Arbor Blues Festival in, the late summer of 1969. As soon as we heard about it, my brother Dan and I were all over that event, and before we knew it, we were in complete charge of taking care of the performers as regards providing them food and drink and making them comfortable. I mean, what could be better than that, especially to dole out alcohol, which was still really big back then, especially with the blues crowd. I mean, we got to say, to give it to them and to hang out with them. Now, the Ann Arbor Blues Festivals were put on by a student committee of some, maybe it's called the Student Activities Committee, part of the University of Michigan. And the person that was really the leader of it was a guy named John Fishel. And what he did that's so wonderful is that he voted down the rest of the group who were suggesting that they have some white British blues group play at the festivals instead of the real deal, the great blues players themselves. After all, back then, 1969, blues was not dead and gone like much of folk music. It was very much alive and well. It was playing just across town. Maybe it was separated perhaps by a racial curtain, but that was it. And it was Fishel who really made this landmark event happen, and I thank him for doing it. So there we were at the festivals, right backstage with the artists, serving them food and booze out of the tailgate of my father's station wagon. And it gets better, so let me set the stage for you. Until that first blues festival in 1969, perhaps a few of these great blues artists may have been together at one venue or club or another, once in a while, but never everyone at one event and all together. This had never happened before, and it has never happened since. Suddenly just about everyone who was anyone in the blues roster was present, standing around talking with one another. It was like a blues convocation in heaven, and there's more. For reasons I still don't fully understand, a number of the blues players like Big Mama Thornton, Arthur Big Boy Crudup, Fred McDowell, Yank Rachel, and others, they showed up many days before the festivals, and who knows why, I don't, but suddenly here they were, being put up at the Michigan League and other places. I can remember going to the West Quad of the University of Michigan. It was one of the student dorms, but it was summer and they were gone. And there was Mississippi Fred McDowell, Yank Rachel, Johnny Young, and others, all tucked away in little dark wood-trimmed rooms. I mean, it boggled our minds. They were everywhere. If there is a blues paradise, for me that was it. I mean, can you imagine? And this conflux of blues greats kind of pushed my buttons until they popped. Here I was actually talking one-on-one with my blues heroes, and then before I knew it, I had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a microphone, and I was officially interviewing these guys. Little did I know that this incredible stream of talent and this energy would divert my life and cause it to segue into something entirely new, although it took some years for this to surface for me. I mean, I had been to Chicago with my band, and we had seen many of these players one at a time, which was very, very different from suddenly being surrounded by them on all sides. The sheer energy of all the artists at that first festival was just powerful. And if you couple that with the fact that I believe the artists there at that first festival had their own minds blown at the same time that we did. This was a first for them too. So my point is that it was some very, very high energy. And I don't know what pooling that many similar minds together can do, but however you want to describe it, we could agree that it was a unique gathering, one that never could be repeated. I mean, even by the time of the second Ann Arbor Blues Festival the following year, in 1970, the blues music world had lost greats like Otis Spann, Lonnie Johnson, Earl Hooker, Slim Harpo, Skip James, Kokomo Arnold, and others. And it's kind of been all downhill from there. That first festival in August of 1969, whatever we could agree it was or it meant, can never be repeated. It was the culmination and coming together of a massive force of minds in one time in one place. I mean, we were all lit up. It was very, very much a celebration. There was joy there. Both the performers and the audience were open to one another and communicating. I mean, here are some quotes that I did interviewing some of the performers at the festivals, just to give you an idea of what they thought. This is from James Cotton. Quote, "I've never seen nothing like this in my life. This is the beautifulest thing I've ever seen in my life. This is so beautiful," end quote. Or Magic Sam, quote, "This festival is like an all-star game," end quote. Or Lewis Myers, "This blues festival is a big family reunion," end quote. Or Luther Tucker, "As for the blues festival, I can dig it. I'm enjoying it," end quote. Or Lightning Hopkins, "Well, I've been looking forward for this for a long time, and I thought this would happen in the future, and it did. So now I hope it lasts long. Fact of business is, I believe it will," end quote. And finally, Sleepy John Estes, "When all the children get together, oh, that will be a day," end quote. You get the idea. Meanwhile, at that first festival, I was busy. I was backstage. I could hear the performances filtering through to the backstage area from out front. But I took little time to go sit out front and watch. I mean, I'd done that for years before, and I much preferred working backstage where I was actually mixing with the artists or getting off to the side with them and tape recording an interview. And further, I had my whole family around me. I'm one of 5 boys, no sisters. And all of my brothers were there. And my dad. Now, my dad was a comptroller by trade, a CFO, a money man. He was all about numbers. I guess I never played by the numbers, and I never was that concerned with financial matters, so he and I had not a lot in common. In my whole life, I cannot remember even one personal or deep conversation with him. But I loved him, and I know that he loved me. But that 1970 Blues Festival was perhaps the only exception I can think of. My father, who had been an actor in college and a performing magician, he was used to, and he liked, and was comfortable with hobnobbing with other performers. Or that's what I realized when I saw him with them. They got tight. Dad came down for almost the entire event, and before I knew it, he was locked in deep discussions and beers with some of the older performers. In particular, Roosevelt Sykes and Dad hung out a lot, sitting back along the fence on a couple of hard-backed wooden chairs, side by side, making points by grabbing each other's arms and so on. And under their chairs was a small army of empty beer cans. Personally, I didn't say much of a word to Dad during the entire festival, but it was one of the most together times we ever spent. Dad was loving what I loved, and that was enough. Now, sometimes I'm asked, what I thought of the festivals. What was I thinking during the festival? Mostly I probably was not thinking, but just being there, living it. Life has its high points, and for me, this is one of them, one of the high points. I was just taking it all in, a moment at a time. In the flurry and hubbub of the constant festival activity, there was something sinking into my mind, my soul, and it had more to do with the interviewing that I was doing than it did with the festival music or even the whole music scene itself, because I already knew the music, but I never before had known the performers, much less up close. And I interviewed scores of performers, not just the headliners or band leaders, but also their sidemen. Certainly I had never been in such proximity to great players as I was here. I mean, in my past there were other times, at places like the Chessmate Coffee House down on Livernois at McNichols in Detroit, sitting in that tiny green room with John Lee Hooker while James Cotton was playing his gig. Hooker was waiting to hang out with Cotton later. Hooker, like Muddy Waters, was regal, dignified, elegant, and beautiful to look at. I mean, the real word for him was awesome. You couldn't help but be in awe of his presence. I mean, I wish I could remember what we talked about. Perhaps we didn't talk much. And of course, James Cotton and his entire band, including Luther Tucker, lived with us for weeks one summer. So that was definitely up close and personal. But in those many interviews I was doing at the first 2 Ann Arbor Blues Festival, and then later on at the 1972 Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Festival, where I had video and a cameraman, and elsewhere, there was another element that was beginning to register with me, and it took hold. I probably couldn't put my finger on it back then, but I sure can now, because, hindsight is 20/20. Of course, the blues music, the music of these great artists, fascinated me. After all, I'd studied it for years and years. But that wasn't it. Instead, it was the wisdom of these men and women, these blues players, that was even more attractive. It was like life wisdom, and it was unlike anything that I ever had known or didn't even know that it existed. But I had always hungered for it. And I'm not saying that all blues performers were open and friendly. Sure, some of the younger ones, like Junior Wells, were more guarded. It may be concerned with acting cool. I mean, they were hip, but distant. But many of the elder blues statesmen like Roosevelt Sykes, Big Mama Thornton, Arthur Big Boy Crudup, they were more than just good musicians. They were kind and compassionate people with a deep experience of life. experience beyond my ability to even measure. I mean, it was all that I could do to just try and soak it up. My brother Dan reminds me of the night that he and I took a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey up to the room where Arthur Big Boy Crudup was staying at the Michigan League, and we knocked at his door. No words were spoken. Crudup opened the door, looked at the bottle of Jack Daniel's, and just said, "Come on in, boys." We were there for hours, just talking and experiencing the wisdom and the kindness of this man who wrote the first big hit Elvis ever sang, "That's All Right, Mama." It was like that. I'm just trying to give you a picture. We spent another evening with Big Mama Thornton up in her room at the League, doing much the same thing, just hanging out and learning. And it was the same over in the tiny rooms of West Quad, where Fred McDowell and others were staying. In those dorm rooms, there was hardly any room at all. But we did fit in as best we could, and we sat at the feet of our heroes. I guess what I'm trying to say is that my takeaway of those landmark festivals was not so much the music as the minds and hearts of these great men and women that I had admired for so many years. And it was the wisdom that they so freely shared, something that I had seldom encountered in my own life anywhere. I mean, all this time I had loved the music, but I had never thought much about what made that music possible. But then on meeting the artists close up, I instantly knew I could see it. It was the quality of their minds, along with their deep experience and compassion, that made the music what it was. All that time, I had it just backward. Thinking that it was the music that made the artist great and not vice versa. Of course, it was the artist that made that music, and I finally saw why and how that worked. So that was the real takeaway of those early blues festivals for me. And it was that element in the music that attracted me to it in the first place, that sense of direct life experience and the wisdom that came out of it, plus the equanimity and kindness of many of the artists. So I followed that trail of wisdom, of kindness, that I felt and saw in the blues until it gradually, literally died away. I once figured out that the average age of the performers, at least the headliners at those early festivals, was something like over 50 years of age at the time. So I was catching the beginning of the end of a major epoch of American music, electric blues, in particular Chicago blues. Later, I was to find the same quality of mind, the same wisdom in the great Tibetan Rinpoches and Lamas that poured into America after the diaspora from Tibet in 1959. When they fled Tibet, many of them came over here when they could, and they too became my life teachers. And it took me almost 20 years before what happened back at those first festivals came to fruition in my own life. That's when I founded the All Music Guide, and I attempted to document the lives and music of musicians of all kinds. And all that started in this same tiny office I sit right now typing this out. There I was in a small town in mid-America, what's called the Heartland. And when other music reviewers on the East and West Coast heard about this guy in the Midwest who had the nerve to attempt to document all recorded music, they laughed, and I don't blame them. Yet today, the All Music Guide is the largest music database of albums, biographies, discographies, tracks, and music content in the world. It just shows you what dedication and perseverance can do. And a lot of that willpower came out of what happened back at those early Ann Arbor Blues Festivals in 1969 and 1970, and then the follow-up Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Festivals in 1972 and 73. It was there that my heart was enlightened by the wisdom of these great blues players, and a purity of intent and dedication was forged in me that was to guide me in creating the All Music Guide. So I saw not only the beauty of the blues artists' music, but the equal beauty of the minds and hearts of these great blues players. And I wanted to do them right, to give them their propers, as they say. And like a pebble dropped in a still pond, the circles of inclusion spread from blues and jazz to all kinds of music. Thus the name All Music Guide. So that's the story of how I experienced those first landmark Ann Arbor Blues Festivals. Sure, there are scores and scores of mini stories in there that I could tell, but hopefully you get the idea. Years later, I served for 2 terms on the board of directors for the Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Festival, and I was appointed as the official historian for that group. And as mentioned, I've written about these original 2 festivals that I've covered here in an award-winning book that I wrote the text for called Blues in Black and White, the Landmark Ann Arbor Blues Festivals. And that book's available if you want to really read the history and see a lot of pictures at Amazon.com. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed it.